Hey guys, tonight we're doing something deeply uneventful, not unimportant. Mind you, just unhurried. We're easing into a story about wheat, water, and wheels that don't spin quickly, not because they can't, but because they know better. You probably won't survive this, not because of any danger, but because within 15 minutes of hearing about wooden paddles and slowly dampening flour sacks, your brain may just give up entirely. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's dozing off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a field now, in a part of medieval England that doesn't particularly care to be noticed. The land is a patchwork of grayish-brown earth and spindly hedgerows, broken occasionally by a path that's more memory than road. Someone nearby is dragging a cart. It squeaks. The cart contains 2 sacks of grain, heavy, uneven, and tied shut with old twine that's been reused so often. It's developed a personality. You're headed to the watermill, not because it's exciting, it isn't, but because it's necessary. And that's how most of medieval life worked, by necessity, not novelty. Watermills have been around in England since Roman times, but during the medieval period, roughly the 11th to 15th centuries, they became quietly essential. Hundreds, then thousands, were built across the countryside, often tucked into slight dips in the land where water could be easily channeled. This particular one is small, 1 story. Its roof is sagging just a little, and moss is growing on one side like it couldn't decide whether or not to be a plant wall. But the wheel still turns, slowly, reluctantly, as if it's done this long enough to not be impressed by itself anymore. The wheel is turned by a stream that doesn't look like much. The water moves at a pace that suggests it could be outrun by a distracted duck. But that's all a mill needs, a steady trickle and a little gravity. The wheel has paddles attached to its rim, and as the water pushes past, it nudges each paddle just enough to turn the wheel. No steam, no noise, no gears grinding in protest, just the slow, wet encouragement of time. And that's your mainstream historical fact. Watermills allowed communities to grind grain without relying on muscle. Before mills, grinding grain required hand-powered querns, 2 heavy stones rotated by the poor soul least likely to complain. With a mill, water did the work, and it did it all day, without demanding lunch or gossiping with neighbors. As you approach the mill, you pass the small wooden sluice gate, a simple board that can be lifted to direct water onto the wheel. If it's closed, the wheel doesn't turn. If it's open too far, the wheel groans. Today, it's open just enough. The water trickles in like it's apologizing. You step into the mill. It smells of damp timber, dusty flour, and whatever the last rainstorm forgot to rinse away. The floorboards don't creak so much as whisper their complaints. Inside, the millstone sits at the heart of everything, a massive, circular slab of stone resting atop another. The top stone spins slowly. The bottom stays still. The grain is fed through a small wooden chute at the center, where it disappears between the stones with a sighing rustle. You can't see the flour emerging. Not yet. That happens underneath, where the ground grain spills into a trough, then into a sack, then into someone's future dinner. A sack is being filled now. It bulges at the sides like it's exhaling. A few flower motes hang in the air, catching light from the small window above. They don't fall fast, they drift. The miller sits nearby on a low stool. He's not working, not actively. He's listening to the rhythm of the wheel, the pace of the grinding, the way the grain feeds down the chute. If something changes, if the wheel speeds up, or the tone of the stone shifts, he'll know before you do. But for now, he does nothing, just listens. That's the thing about watermills. They're not dramatic. They don't speed up or slow down dramatically. They hum, they murmur, they exist in a state of almost motion. And now, your quirky tidbit to some medieval mills were built so slowly and repaired so often that no one remembered who originally constructed them. They simply had always been there. A few were named after long-forgotten people. Tilda's Wheel, the Old East Mill, Mill Below the Birch. None of those names were official. They just stuck. And the scholarly uncertainty for this section. Historians still debate whether early English mills were first driven by undershot or overshot wheels. Undershot wheels sit in the stream and catch water at the bottom. Overshot wheels have water poured over the top from a channel. Overshot wheels are more efficient, but they require elevation. Some records suggest overshot wheels arrived earlier than we once thought, especially in hilly regions. Others argue most early mills used the simpler undershot method and only transitioned later. It likely depended on the terrain, the builder's budget, and whether anyone in the village had the energy to dig a higher channel. You step back outside. The wheel turns behind you. A soft splash, a sigh of stone, a drift of flower caught on the breeze. No one claps, no one points. The mill is still working because it never stopped. You're still beside the water wheel, watching it move with the calm, tired confidence of something that's been doing the same job since before your great-great-grandmother's favorite mug was a rock. It creaks a little with each turn, not out of protest, but out of habit. Water hits the paddles at just the right angle, pushing gently, evenly. The wheel turns, not fast, never fast, but steadily enough to spin 2 stones heavy enough to flatten your week's worries into something flower-like. And you're beginning to see it now, how medieval watermills didn't work by force. They worked by timing, gravity, humidity, that sort of understated magic people forget to notice. This is where the water becomes work. Here's the mainstream fact. A medieval watermill took kinetic energy from flowing water and converted it into rotary motion through a wheel. That motion powered a series of mechanical components, shafts, cogs, and ultimately the millstones themselves. But it all started with a stream, not a river, not a waterfall, just a stream with somewhere to be. There are 3 common types of medieval water wheels that undershot, where water flows beneath the wheel and pushes its paddles from the bottom, the breastshot, where water hits the wheel about halfway up, and the overshot, where water pours over the top, usually from a raised flume. Each type has its own tempo. An undershot wheel is the simplest. Just build next to the stream and let it push. Less efficient, maybe 25% of the water's energy gets used, but perfect for flat landscapes. These were common in much of southern England, where the land rarely made dramatic decisions. Overshot wheels, by contrast, Take planning. The stream must be diverted into a raised channel, called a leat, so it can drop from above. The drop gives it extra momentum. Overshot wheels can reach up to 65% efficiency, especially with well-fitted buckets on the rim. It's like giving the water a head start and a reason to try. These were more common in hilly terrain, Yorkshire, parts of Devon, where elevation politely offered itself. Breast-shot wheels sit in between, compromise wheels, often built in places where someone said, well, it's not ideal, but it'll work. They're driven by water flowing at mid-height, which is surprisingly useful when elevation is partial and enthusiasm is mild. This mill probably an undershot, is that the wheels too low and the ground too flat to do anything else, but it's not disappointed about that. It just turns. Now you step inside again, and this time you notice the drive shaft, a thick timber beam connected to the axle of the water wheel, turning along with it. This is what brings the motion from outside to inside. The shaft connects to a large wooden gear called the pit wheel, which turns another vertical gear, the wallower. The wallower, in turn, spins a vertical shaft leading up to the millstones. The system works like a lazy, timber-based Rube Goldberg machine, minus the bells and overcomplicated marbles. Just a few carefully shaped wooden teeth clicking together, turning stone against stone. And here's the quirky tidbit, for this section mill gears were made of wood, not just because iron was expensive, but because wooden teeth were quieter and easier to repair. If a gear tooth broke, and they often did, it could be replaced individually. Some millers carried spares like others might carry spare buttons or excuses. Also, wooden gears swelled slightly in humid environments, which meant they stayed tighter fitted in damp mills. It wasn't just clever, it was necessary. Mills were damp, drafty, and often suspiciously moldy. If your gear slipped, you'd lose hours of grinding and possibly gain a deeply disappointed baker. Now for the scholarly uncertainty. How were these wooden gears calibrated and aligned without precise measuring tools? We know that millwrights, the craftspeople who built and maintained mills, had their own sets of rules, but very few written records survive. Much of their work was done by eye, feel, and repeated testing. The phrase "a good ear for the wheel" wasn't metaphor. They listened for skips in the rhythm, for uneven thuds that suggested a gear tooth was misaligned. Some historians believe millwrights used informal, string-based measurement systems, stretching cords across beams, notching them with charcoal, but it's unclear how widespread this was. Others insist the millwright's main tools were simply experience and suspicion. Back inside. The wheel turns a little faster now. Perhaps the sluice gate outside was opened slightly more. The millstones above make a sound like fabric being folded again and again, a low rubbing rhythm that might annoy you if it were louder. But at this level, it soothes. The floor vibrates gently, not like a drum, like an old cat purring in its sleep. And here comes your flour, soft, pale, drifting down through a wooden chute into an open sack. The miller tests it by rubbing a pinch between thumb and forefinger. He doesn't taste it. He's not trying to impress anyone. He's checking for texture. If it feels smooth, the stones are spaced well. If it feels gritty, he'll need to adjust the runner stone up or down using the simple lever and wedge system next to the shaft. There's no dial, no readout, just a wedge, a counterweight, and years of muscle memory. You step outside again. The stream burbles past. A frog watches you from a patch of mud and doesn't blink. The wheel turns, not once quickly, not once proudly, just again. Because that's how water turns into work. Not with a splash, but with rhythm. You're inside the mill again, though it's hard to say you ever truly left. The walls are thick, low, and slightly damp, built from stones that seem too irregular to stack well, but do, somehow, hold each other up. Dust floats in the beams of sunlight that squeeze through small, high windows, and the smell of old grain settles into your clothes like it's always been there. Now your eyes adjust, and you finally focus on the heart of it all, the millstones. Not one, but two, huge, circular, heavy enough to stay still forever, unless you happen to bolt one of them to a rotating shaft and trust it to grind your village's grain into something soft enough to bake into bread. Let's start with your mainstream fact. The millstones in a medieval English watermill consisted of a stationary bedstone and a rotating runner stone. The runner was fixed to a vertical shaft connected to the gear system we followed earlier. It turned slowly, anywhere from 90 to 120 revolutions per minute, enough to convert raw grain into fine flour without scorching it or flinging it around the room. The two stones weren't smooth. That would be useless. Instead, they were dressed, carved with grooves, furrows, and patterns designed to shear, crush, and funnel the grain. This dressing wore down over time and had to be redone by hand with a specialized tool called a mill bill, a chisel hammer hybrid that made a sound like determined ticking when in use. And here's where the stones got personal. Each pair of millstones was dressed differently, not wildly, but subtly. One might have deeper furrows, another might favor wider lands, the flat parts between the grooves. These differences changed the texture and speed of the grind, much like adjusting the settings on a modern food processor. If your food processor weighed a ton and came with a name, yes, millstones had names. Sometimes the good ones, ones that ground evenly and didn't throw off too much flour dust. They were nicknamed after saints, animals, or, in one case, an unusually quiet drunk named Martin with the Sigh. That particular stone reportedly ground so softly that people asked to nap beside it. Whether or not they actually did, no one wrote that down. Now for your quirky details, some millers sprinkled a bit of fine flour on the stones, not just to check the grind, but to test how well the dressing grooves were working. A thin coat of dust would settle in patterns. If it spread evenly, the stones were balanced. If it clumped or bunched, it meant uneven wear, or a mouse had gotten into the feed again. That happened more than you'd think. Mice found mills warm and crumb-filled. They weren't welcome, but they were expected. The stones themselves were typically made from hard, durable materials. The best were French burrstones, a fine-grained, naturally banded stone sourced from specific quarries in northern France. These were expensive and had to be imported in pieces, then bound together with iron bands. Most English mills, however, used local millstone grit, hard sandstone from Derbyshire or Yorkshire, rougher but dependable and local, which meant cheaper and more replaceable if cracked during frost or a particularly cranky sluice adjustment. And now, the scholarly uncertainty. How often were millstones redressed? We know that over time, the grooves wore down, reducing milling efficiency and producing coarse flour. Some estimates suggest every few months, others say once or twice a year, depending on use. But records are spotty. Most millers didn't log their stone maintenance schedules. They just listened, felt, lifted a handful of flour and pressed it between their palms, if it whispered back correctly. The stones were fine. If it clung or gritted or blew away too fast, it was time to fetch the mill bill. It was a tactile science. No numbers, no charts, just calluses and instincts. The gap between the stones was crucial, too wide, and the grain wouldn't grind, too tight, and the flour scorched. Adjustment came via a tentering mechanism, a long lever that lifted or lowered the runner stone, usually aided by a wedge or a system of wooden teeth. Some had counterweights, others relied on simple muscle and muttering. You move a little closer now. The sound of the stones isn't harsh, it's a rhythmic scuffing, like someone smoothing linen with calloused hands. The floor beneath them pulses just slightly with each turn, not shakily, just enough to remind you that this room is alive, or at least very practiced at pretending to be. Sacks lean in corners, some full, some half. Some collapsed into themselves like they're tired of waiting. The flour in them is warm, not hot, but gently heated from friction. Freshly milled flour has a soft, yeasty scent, mixed with stone and something almost metallic. You catch it now, something old, unpolished, but wholesome, like a smell passed down without explanation. The miller leans on his shovel. He's listening again. His head tilts every few minutes. If you ask him what he hears, he might say, "Too dry," or "She's hungry," or maybe he'll just nod toward the hopper, where grain feeds down through a shaking chute like sand in a slow hourglass. The flour drifts into another sack, and another. Some are labeled with wax or charcoal, others with no labels at all, because the miller knows who's picking them up. He knows whose barley comes in tied with red string, and who uses oat sacks even when they're grinding rye. The sacks don't need names. The stones don't need explanations. They just turn. You step back once more, watching the runner spin. It doesn't spin fast. It doesn't spin hard. But it spins right. And that's all it needs to do. The miller clears his throat, not because he's about to speak, but because flour has a way of finding your lungs even when you try not to breathe it. He doesn't look tired. He looks settled, like a man who's been standing in the same pair of boots for 27 years, and he has no interest in moving faster than the wheel requires. This section is about him, the miller. Not heroic, not tragic, just consistently dusty. Let's begin with the mainstream fact. The medieval English miller held a surprisingly important role in village life. He operated the mill, maintained the equipment, and ensured that the community's grain, its food, its livelihood, was turned into flour. Without him, no bread, no porridge, no pies, just a lot of angry peasants staring at raw grain and sore arms from hand grinding. But while essential, the miller was also frequently distrusted. This is the quiet contradiction at the center of his role. He was respected, needed, and occasionally feared, all at once, because even if your flour sack was a little light, or your grain was a little damp, you still had to go back to the same man next week. He knew it. You knew it. The tension hovered like flour dust in a sunbeam. The miller's job wasn't just turning grain into flour, it was overseeing a system that operated with almost no oversight. Villagers brought grain. The miller took his fee, usually a fraction of the flour, milled the rest, and sent them home. If the flour was coarse, you might complain, but quietly, if it seemed short, you might grumble, but with a smile. After all, he was the only man who knew how to lift the runner stone without breaking a finger. Now, your quirky tidbit, some medieval millers kept small pebbles in their aprons, not as tools, but as subtle weights. When no one was looking, they might add one to a sack to make it seem heavier. This was known as putting a thumb on the scale, though in truth it was more like putting a very smooth rock at the bottom. It didn't fool everyone, but it fooled enough. This kind of quiet manipulation gave rise to an entire genre of miller-related folklore, from Chaucer's shifty, red-haired miller with a bagpipe and a wart, to local rhymes accusing millers of always stealing a peck for themselves. The image of the miller became one of winking suspicion, a man who worked hard, yes, but maybe helped himself a little too freely along the way. Of course, not all millers were like this. Some were honest to a fault. Some took less than their due during famine years. One record from the 14th century describes a miller who returned flour to a widow who'd been shorted by her landlord. She brought him turnips every winter after that. No words, just turnips, and here's the scholarly uncertainty how widespread were miller abuses. Really, court records suggest frequent disputes over short-weighted sacks, uneven grind, or unauthorized tolls. But these records also may reflect broader tensions between villagers and feudal lords, between peasants and landlords, rather than the personal ethics of the millers themselves. Some scholars argue that millers were convenient scapegoats. Others believe the temptation to cheat was simply too baked into the system to resist. The truth, probably both. Some were generous, some were opportunists, most, like anyone, were a blend of both, adjusting behavior with the seasons, the weather, and the likelihood of getting caught. You glance around the mill again. There's a shovel propped against a wall, a cracked cup near the doorway, holding a few stalks of barley like someone started a bouquet and got bored. The miller adjusts the hopper with one hand, then tugs at the drawstring of his pouch with the other. He doesn't count his coin. He feels the weight. Even the tax collector doesn't ask for numbers, just a share. And that's another part of the job, the paperwork, such as it was. Most medieval millers owed a portion of their profits to someone, a local lord, a monastery, or the crown, sometimes all three. Records were scratched into wax tablets or scrawled onto parchment, if they were recorded at all. More often, the system ran on memory, trust, and the assumption that everyone would take just a little more than they admitted. Mills were often leased, not owned. A miller might work under a contract that required annual payments, or a portion of the grain, or even labor during harvest. And if the wheel froze in winter too bad, rent was still due. So yes, millers cheated sometimes, but they were also cheated, frequently, quietly, and they kept working. The runner's stone hums overhead now, and the miller sits, not to rest, just to stop moving. He's still listening, always listening, because if the pitch of the wheel changes, if the chute feeds too fast, if the flour smells wrong, he needs to know before someone else notices. He'll adjust. He always does, because if nothing else, the miller is consistent, not flashy, not beloved, not invited to every festival. But when winter comes and grain is low, and you need bread, and the hand quern makes your shoulder ache, and your neighbor swears he saw mice in his oat bin, you'll carry your sack back down the muddy path, and you'll hand it, without ceremony, to the man who stands where the flour falls. It rained yesterday, a proper rain, the kind that leaves puddles you could lose a shoe in and turns the path to the mill into a politely squishy mess. Today, though, the sky is just gray enough to warn you not to plan anything ambitious. The wheel outside is turning a little slower, not because it's tired, but because the stream is swollen and unpredictable. Water slaps instead of flows. The sluice gate creaks. The miller sighs. This section is about weather, not stormy, dramatic weather, not snowdrifts and firewood crises, just the kind of daily weather that makes a miller glance at the clouds and quietly rearrange his expectations. Let's start with the mainstream fact. The operation of a medieval watermill was entirely dependent on the local climate. Too much rain, and the stream would flood, submerging the wheel, halting the mechanism, or even damaging the mill's foundation. Too little rain, and the flow would slow to a trickle. Either way, milling stopped. No one consulted a schedule. They consulted puddles. In the best seasons, spring and early autumn, the water flowed just fast enough to turn the wheel at a steady rhythm. In summer, the streams often dried up, especially in southern England, where rainfall was less predictable. In winter, the issue wasn't dryness, but freezing. If the wheel iced over or the sluice froze shut, the whole operation paused until a warm day nudged everything back into motion. And when the mill paused, so did baking. That's the thing about weather and water mills. They weren't just connected. They were co-conspirators in the subtle sabotage of food preparation. If it rained too hard, people grumbled about soggy grain and delayed flour. If it didn't rain enough, they muttered over querns, grinding by hand like it was 1066 all over again. Now for the quirky bit, some millers became amateur weather forecasters by necessity. They'd observe bird behavior, the smell of the stream, the thickness of morning mist. One miller in Wiltshire reportedly tied a string to a willow branch and noted how much it swayed before deciding whether to open the sluice gate. His neighbors didn't always believe his methods, but his flour rarely ran out. Others installed makeshift rain gutters or canvas shields to protect the wheel during storms, not for the sake of comfort, but to keep water pressure steady. A wheel turning too fast could lead to scorched flour, broken gears, or, at worst, a jammed millstone, which required everything to be shut down and disassembled with solemn muttering. And this brings us to the scholarly uncertainty. How accurate were medieval records of mill downtime due to weather manorial accounts that sometimes list non-operational days? But it's not always clear if the cause was rain, frost, or simply a miller feeling under the weather himself. Letters and chronicles mention flooded mills occasionally, but often without details. Some historians argue that mills were down more often than we think. Others point to backup systems, like hand querns or traveling mill carts used in emergencies, as evidence that communities had flexible strategies. But the reality is likely a mix of foresight, improvisation, and mild exasperation. You step outside now. A crow calls from the far side of the stream. The water looks muddier than yesterday. The wheel catches a current, jerks slightly, then returns to its slow rhythm. The miller watches from the doorway, its arms folded. He doesn't panic. He doesn't adjust anything yet. He's watching how long the surge lasts. You glance at the sky. No sun, just a cloud that looks like it can't make up its mind. That's all it takes to throw off a morning's work. A half-hearted cloud and a distracted stream. Some millers dealt with this by digging mill ponds, small reservoirs to store water upstream and release it gradually when the stream ran low. It was clever engineering for the time and required a good understanding of local terrain. Not all mills had them. Not all millers wanted the responsibility of managing a pond and its moody dam gate. One fringe anecdote: a miller in northern England supposedly placed small clay statues, crudely shaped frogs and ducks, around his pond to bring balance to the water. He claimed the frogs liked consistency. A visiting monk once asked him why he didn't pray for steady rain instead. The miller replied, "Prayers are for souls, frogs are for streams. You step back inside. The stones are still turning, though slower than yesterday. The grain flows in thinner streams. The flour lands with softer sound. Not a problem, not yet." But the miller has already adjusted the hopper slightly. He's shaved a bit off the wedge, shifted his stance, the kind of changes you wouldn't notice unless you've spent half your life watching water behave like it has opinions. And the thing is, the flour will still come, maybe slower, maybe in smaller sacks, but it will arrive, because weather may annoy a miller, but it rarely surprises him. He just waits. He just listens. He just keeps one hand on the sluice gate and one eye on the sky. Not because he controls either, but because it's his job to understand when not to try. The sun finally makes a half-hearted appearance, filtering down through a gap in the clouds, like it had forgotten today was its shift. The stream settles. The mill wheel turns more confidently now, not with speed, but with consistency. And just off to the side, tucked into a low wooden frame, is the mill's quietest mechanism, the sluice gate. It's not large. It doesn't creak dramatically. No steam, no levers, no angry gears. Just a simple board, a few notches, and a handle worn smooth by generations of cautious hands. This section drifts gently into the ritual of sluice gate control, an unglamorous but essential part of every working watermill. Here's your mainstream fact. The sluice gate regulates how much water reaches the mill wheel. By raising or lowering the gate, the miller controls the volume and speed of water, which in turn controls how fast the wheel turns, and by extension, how efficiently the millstones grind grain. Too little flow, and the wheel drags. Too much, and the whole system can spin itself into a mess of broken gear teeth and panicked sweeping. The sluice gate itself is simple, a flat plank of wood mounted vertically in a slot between stone or timber walls. Lift the plank, and water flows. Drop it, and the stream is blocked or diverted. Most gates were moved by hand, sometimes with a winch or iron bar for leverage. Nothing complex, just wet wood, determined millers, and the occasional shoe lost to a patch of mud that hadn't looked like mud 5 seconds ago. Milling began each day with the sluice. Before the grain was poured, before the hopper creaked, before the stones turned, the gate was adjusted, and not once, multiple times, as the stream rose, as the sacks emptied, as clouds wandered past. The miller watched the wheel like a clockmaker watches a pendulum. Any change in rhythm meant a return to the gate. Here's your quirky detail: some sluice gates had carved notches along the handle, so millers could remember favored settings. A third notch lift for dry barley, a half notch for damp rye. No one wrote this down. It was stored in muscle memory, or mumbled between millers when they thought no one else was listening. And in larger mills, particularly those owned by monasteries or wealthy estates, there might be more than one gate, one to divert water to the wheel, another to control a side channel, sometimes even a spillway for emergencies. Though emergency in this context usually meant it's raining too much, and I don't want to have to fix the wheel again. Now, for the scholarly uncertainty, how often were sluice gate adjustments made during daily operation? Records mention frequent tending or watched diligently, but few specifics. Some historians believe millers stood near the gate most of the day, especially during busy seasons. Others argue they adjusted it only a few times per hour, trusting their ears and the hum of the mill to alert them if something drifted off rhythm, and drift it did. The stream was not a loyal servant. It changed speed based on distant rainfall, beaver activity, upstream disputes, or, occasionally, ducks. One record from the 14th century casually mentions a duck lodging itself under a sluice gate and throwing off the entire day's grinding. The miller had to wait for it to swim out voluntarily. But the sluice was more than a tool. It was a ritual. Opening it wasn't just about water. It was about control. The only moment the miller fully directed what happened. Once the wheel turned, the rest of the system took over. Stones grinding, flour falling, gears creaking like old joints. But the sluice that was the reset button, the beginning, the point where decision and delay met. A fringe anecdote for you in one small village in Kent. The miller's apprentice was reportedly forbidden from touching the sluice gate until he could name 10 types of flour by texture alone. He passed the test, eventually, but not before getting soaked by a surprise spring thaw and falling in the channel 3 times. The gate, it turns out, was less forgiving than it looked. Back at your mill now. The gate has been lowered just a bit. The wheel slows, not alarmingly, just enough that the pitch of the stones shifts. The miller waits, listens, adjusts. No hurry. This happens at least twice a day, sometimes more, and when it's time to shut down the mill, the sluice closes first, not all the way, but enough to let the wheel finish its last rotation with dignity. The stones stop. The sack stops filling. Dust settles. The air stills. The gate stays closed overnight, not locked, just left alone, with the quiet trust that the stream will still be there tomorrow, and that someone, likely the same someone, will return at dawn to lift the board, test the wheel, and watch water become work once again. There's a small wooden tablet on the wall, barely visible under layers of dust and spiderweb. Carved into it are a few names, a date, and what might be a rude joke in Latin, or maybe just a measurement that no longer means anything to anyone. The tablet's been there longer than the current miller, longer than the last wheel, even, because this mill, like many others in medieval England, doesn't belong to the man who operates it. It belongs to someone higher up the food chain, someone drier, probably wearing better shoes. This section turns softly into the gentle tangle of ownership, power, and profit that surrounded watermills, not with swords or sieges, but with leases, tolls, and the weary sighs of tenants who couldn't do anything about any of it. Here's your mainstream fact. Most medieval English watermills weren't privately owned by the millers who worked them. Instead, they were built and controlled by feudal lords, monastic communities, or large manorial estates. The miller was a hired hand, a tenant, or a contractor, paid in kind or coin to operate the machinery, keep it maintained, and most importantly, collect the lord's share of flour. This arrangement was codified in the system of milling rights. Lords had what was called the banal right, the legal authority to compel peasants on their lands to use the lord's mill and no other. You couldn't just build your own quern in the back garden and skip the middleman. That would be illegal and quite possibly frowned upon during Sunday Mass. Instead, villagers brought their grain to the manorial mill. The miller took his multure, a fixed percentage of the ground flour, usually around 1/16, though it varied. A portion of that went to the lord. The rest, theoretically, went to the miller, unless someone along the chain helped themselves first, which, as we've established, happened more often than people liked to admit. Now for the quirky tidbit, monastic mills were often among the best maintained, run by lay brothers or hired experts. They benefited from the efficiency and record-keeping habits of the church. Some abbeys even had multiple mills, one for wheat, one for malt, one for backup in case of divine inconvenience. A few monasteries kept mill books, where they noted how many sacks were processed per week, along with helpful comments like "stone now turns unevenly," or "Brother Godric again attempted to grease the axle with lamp oil." Remind him, in many cases, these monastic mills weren't just for the monastery's own use. They served the local community and charged fees like any other lord-owned operation. The only difference: the profits went toward the upkeep of the cloister, the garden, and the occasional new bell. And now the scholarly uncertainty: to what extent did milling rights actually suppress local initiative? It's true that many peasants were legally bound to use the local lord's mill, but archaeological evidence suggests that hand querns and small-scale home grinding persisted, sometimes even with the lord's tacit approval. Some historians argue that enforcement of milling rights was spotty and often overlooked unless the local economy was in crisis or the lord was feeling particularly short on wine. Others suggest that when lords did enforce the right, they did so forcefully, confiscating handstones, issuing fines, or even destroying unauthorized mills. One 13th century document describes a lord ordering his reeve to break up a suspiciously flat stone used in a suspiciously circular fashion. No one confessed, but the grain stopped disappearing at night after that. You step into the cool back corner of the mill now, where ledgers are kept, not the bound, leather-covered kind. These are chalk marks on wooden beams, lines, circles, the occasional symbol. The miller understands them. They track tolls, repairs, Maybe debts owed by neighbors who promised to bring barley next week and meant when it rains less. The Lord's steward comes once a month. He doesn't linger. He collects his portion, sometimes counts sacks, and almost never asks questions, because he doesn't need to. The system works, not efficiently, but predictably, and predictability is its own kind of power. One fringe anecdote in a small mill near the Welsh border. The Lord insisted on inspecting the stones personally once a year. No one knows why. He wasn't a millwright, and he never offered suggestions. He would simply run his hand across the runner, nod, and then leave without saying a word. The miller eventually carved a small smiley face into one groove just to see if he'd notice. He never did. You return to the front of the mill. A new sack has been placed at the chute. The hopper creaks. The wheel turns. Somewhere downstream, the stream bends toward a manor house with carved windows and less mud, and you're reminded that this soft, dusty building is part of something larger, an economic web made not of contracts and ledgers, but habits and obligations. The miller knows what's expected, the Lord knows what's owed, and the villagers, they know to keep an extra handful of grain, just in case the toll seems a little generous this week, because the water flows, the wheel turns, and the flour, like taxes, always finds its way upward. There's a rhythm to the mill that isn't mechanical. The wheel turns, yes, the gears grind, the stones rub, the hopper clatters. But beyond all that, there's a gentler layer, a quieter pattern made up of sounds that don't demand your attention but reward it if you listen long enough. A light tapping as grain trickles into the eye of the runner stone, a soft hiss as flour drifts down into the sack, the occasional sigh of the floorboard under the miller's heel. It's not music, but it's close. Tonight, this section is about the soundscape of the medieval watermill, the mill songs, the flour whispers, and the peculiar calm that comes from knowing everything is turning exactly as it should. Let's begin with the mainstream fact. A working watermill produced a low, constant background noise, enough to fill a space, but rarely enough to overwhelm conversation, unlike the industrial roar of later mechanized mills. Medieval mills moved slowly, deliberately. The wooden gears creaked. The runner stone slid in a low rasp over the bedstone. Grain rattled as it fed down the chute. It wasn't silence, but it wasn't noise either. Mills were among the few places in the medieval countryside where human-made sounds were constant. A plow paused. A blacksmith's hammer struck in bursts, but the mill kept turning, for hours, sometimes all day. The miller knew how to tune his ears to the pitch of the grind. He could tell by sound alone if the hopper was feeding too fast, or if the flour was scorching from friction, or if the wheel was catching weeds from upstream. And here's the quirky bit in some places. Millers added bells, not for announcements, but for monitoring. A small bell tied to the hopper's feed gate would stop ringing when the grain ran out. The absence of sound became its own alert. In one Yorkshire record, a miller called it the tongue of the sack. If the bell fell silent, he'd mutter. The sacks had its say, and go refill the hopper without needing to look. In larger monastic mills, lay brothers worked in shifts. They used hand signs more than words. Talking over the mill's constant whir was frowned upon, especially when holy silence was encouraged. A nod meant add grain. A raised eyebrow meant check the chute. A hand pressed flat meant stop the wheel. They weren't efficient signs, but they were polite. Some mills had familiar songs attached to them, not written or sung, but described. Travelers would describe the tune of the lower mill or the old sound of St. Mildred's wheel, one poem, now mostly lost. Referred to the sleepy clatter of St. Elfric's grain box. That's not a compliment, but it is an observation. Millers themselves sometimes hummed while working, not out of joy or habit, but to match the rhythm of their labor. One particularly sleepy-sounding rhythm became known in one region as the flower drone. It wasn't a melody. It was just breath pushed slowly past a closed mouth, rising and falling like the pitch of the wheel itself. Now for the scholarly uncertainty, did medieval mills actually inspire musical rhythms in local songs or dances? Some musicologists argue yes, pointing to folk songs whose tempos match common millstone rotations. Others suggest it's coincidence, or at most, a reflection of shared rural pace. One interesting theory posits that lullabies in mill-heavy regions trended toward slower, even pulses, because children fell asleep to the sound of grinding stones rather than silence. Fringe detail, a traveling cleric once claimed that he napped better in mills than in monasteries. The stones speak softly, he wrote, and they do not ask questions. He described the sound of the flour falling into the sack as the same rhythm as breathing. His letter goes on to praise the miller's apprentice for tea and quiet conversation. But it's the rhythm he remembered. You sit now on a low bench near the flower chute. The air is thick with dust motes, but the light makes them look like snowflakes falling sideways. The sack beneath the chute swells, not quickly, just gradually, like bread rising in reverse. The grain above slips down in a tiny cascade, too fast to count, but too slow to notice immediately. You close your eyes and listen. The wheel outside makes a lapping sound, like a slow tide slapping the hull of a wooden boat. The gears hum, not whining, not screeching, just humming. The stones sing in their own way, a song with no beginning, no end. The sack fills, exhaling gently with every pound added. It's not quiet, but it is peaceful, like someone whispering a memory that wasn't yours, but still feels familiar. That's what mill sounds do. They surround you, not in volume, but in rhythm. You leave the mill now, stepping outside into the soft afternoon. A finch trills from a willow branch, somewhere across the field. A cow acknowledges the existence of another cow, but the mill's sound follows you, not loudly, just enough to remind you that flour is still being made, still falling like soft snow into waiting cloth, still humming the old, patient tune of grain turned gently into food. You step back inside the mill, brushing a little flour from your sleeve. Not that it makes much difference. Everything in here is dusted. The air, the rafters, even the window light looks a bit flour-colored. And beside the stones, tucked into baskets and barrels and open sacks, is the rest of the story, the bits that aren't flour, bran, chaff, germ, grit, what the mill doesn't keep, what the baker doesn't want, what still finds its way into every corner of the room and every part of the local economy. This section follows the leftovers, the fragments sifted out after the grind, and traces the quiet roles they played in medieval life. Let's begin with the mainstream fact. Milling doesn't just produce flour, it also produces bran, the outer husk of the grain, and chaff, the lighter, flakier material that sometimes clings to the surface of the grain and gets separated either before or after milling. These byproducts weren't waste, they were just repurposed. Bran, coarser and heavier, was often used as animal feed, especially for pigs and poultry. It could be soaked into mash, mixed into slop, or added to porridge for livestock. Some lower class households even sifted it again, trying to extract one more handful of usable flour. This was called second flour or brown flour, and while it made rougher bread, it filled stomachs just the same. Chaff, on the other hand, was harder to work with, too light to grind, too dry to chew. It was typically used as insulation, stuffed into mattress sacks, spread on dirt floors to keep down mud, or thrown into compost piles. Occasionally, it was burned, though it didn't make good fuel, just a lot of smoke and very little warmth. And now, your quirky tidbit. Some monks reportedly used bran to polish wooden tableware. The coarse texture helped scrub away wax or dried on food, and it left a faint smell of grain behind. One 13th century rulebook for a Cistercian kitchen includes the line bran may be used for scourings, but not hoarded, lest the pigs suffer. This leads us to an odd social divide. People had opinions about bran, strong ones, refined flour, pale, soft, well sifted, was preferred by the wealthy and by institutions like churches and manorial kitchens. Bran heavy bread was seen as lower quality, even if more nutritious. Peasants, out of necessity, ate darker loaves. Monks, out of humility, often did too, though the kitchen brothers were known to sift twice if the abbot wasn't looking. Some households dried bran further, crushed it, and used it as a thickener for stews. Others fed it to dogs, and one surviving recipe from the early 15th century lists it as an ingredient in a poultice for sprains mixed with wine, vinegar, and a good root. Then apply to the sore part and wait for a small miracle. But the scholarly uncertainty here is perhaps the most quietly debated how much of the grain was actually retained in common milling, that is, did the average medieval miller grind the whole grain and let the customer do the sifting? Or did the miller remove bran and chaff during the process and keep it as part of his fee, or resell it elsewhere? The answer likely varies by region, period, and social class. Some mills provided a basic grind, and households owned their own sieves or bolting cloths, woven mesh used to separate flour grades. Others, especially those attached to wealthier estates, operated with multiple grinds and built-in sifting equipment. Monastic mills often had fine sieves for ecclesiastical baking and coarser ones for charity loaves. In small villages, nothing was wasted. Chaff patted chicken nests, bran fed goats. One record mentions a miller who traded his weekly bran allowance for candles. Another mentions a tenant who requested the rough scrapings of the stone during winter, possibly to make a porridge thick enough to pass for stew. A fringe anecdote, a 14th century herbalist recommended applying warm bran to one's boots in winter. Not to eat, just to soothe cold feet. Let it be stirred with broth and pressed to the sole, she wrote, and the chill shall yield. Whether or not it worked is unclear, but her feet were probably well seasoned, back inside the mill. The miller scoops a rough handful of bran into a wooden bucket. He sets it near the door. Someone will collect it before dusk. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a swineherd, maybe the priest's housekeeper, who bakes the dark loaves for visiting pilgrims. The flour's gone, but the rest remains, and the rest, in its own way, matters, because in medieval life, nothing ended with the main product. Not grain, not labor, not even time. There was always the leftover bit, the extra, the dust, the part no one planned for, but everyone eventually used. The bran that fed the pig, the chaff that padded the bench, the crumb that thickened the stew, the story that outlasted the bread. Outside, a chicken pecks at the corner of a spilled sack. Flour, bran, dust. It doesn't care which. The sun begins to dip. The wheel keeps turning. Even the parts we discard have places to be. You can almost hear it now. The muttering, low, consistent, never quite loud enough to start a fight. It hovers outside the mill door, rolls down the lane to the village, and curls up beside the fire after supper. It's not rage. It's not protest. It's something much quieter and far more enduring grumbling. This section takes us into the quiet world of grain taxes and local resentment, where nobody shouts, but everyone keeps track. Let's begin with the mainstream fact in medieval England. Milling was not just a service, it was a regulated obligation. Lords, monasteries, and manorial officials collected tolls on grain ground at the mill. These tolls were often paid in kind, a set fraction of the flour or grain was kept by the miller or the lord's agent as payment. This fraction, known as the multure, could vary by region or even by season, but a common rate was 1/16 of the total milled. And while this may sound fair, after all, someone had to maintain the mill, pay the miller, and clean up the flour. Villagers often viewed the process with deep suspicion, because the weighing, that's where the trouble began. Grain was brought in sacks, often tied with rope, marked with charcoal, or pinned with tokens to distinguish one tenant's barley from another's rye. Once milled, the flour was returned, minus the toll. But how much was actually kept, and who measured it? Now for the quirky bit, some millers used standardized weights, carved from local stone or shaped from metal. These were supposed to ensure fairness, but locals believed many of them were rigged. In one small Norfolk village, a miller's measuring scoop was accused of being twice deep and half square. The case went nowhere, but the nickname stuck. They called him Master Half Scoop for a decade. Disputes over milling tolls rarely made it to court, but they showed up in manorial records as fines, forfeitures, and cryptic notes like John of the Woad brought weight not agreed. That meant he argued. That meant he lost. It's worth noting, too, that not all mills charged the same way. Some charged per sack, others charged per day. A few charged based on the intended use of the coarser flour for animal feed, lower rate. Fine white flour for a wedding loaf, that'll cost extra. And then there were the fees layered on top of the toll road fees for transporting grain, storage fees for sacks left overnight, even inspection fees for millstones. One record from Sussex describes a tenant being fined for delay in sack retrieval, suggesting he left his flour too long and perhaps annoyed the miller. Here's the scholarly uncertainty. How widespread was this resentment? Was it just a few noisy villagers? Or was it a general undercurrent of frustration woven into daily life? Historians disagree. Some argue that milling was a source of quiet but constant tension. particularly during bad harvest years when tolls felt like cruelty. Others suggest it was simply accepted, like weather or taxes, as something you couldn't change, but were fully entitled to grumble about over dinner. There's also debate about how often peasants tried to evade the system entirely. Archaeological evidence occasionally turns up small quernstones, simple hand grinders, in cottages long after they were technically outlawed under milling rights. Were they hiding them? Were they still used secretly for small batches? Or were they just holdovers? Saved like old tools no one quite wanted to throw out. What we do know is this. People watched their flour carefully. If the sack came back too light, they noticed. If the bread rose thin, they noticed. If the pigs didn't get their bran ration, they definitely noticed. And the miller noticed their noticing, which is why many millers went out of their way to appear generous. They might round up a bit, toss in an extra scoop if the tenant's child looked thin, or, in one recorded case, allow the village widow to mill her grain toll-free once a month for God's comfort. The record reads, Fringe anecdote in Lincolnshire. A baker named Alric was said to carry a small set of hand scales tucked into his cloak. He'd weigh his flour on the spot after collecting it from the mill. If it came up short, he'd simply whistle, not at anyone, just loudly. Then he'd sit on a rock and wait. The miller always noticed, and, usually, added a scoop back inside the mill. The latest sack is full. The miller doesn't look at it. He lifts it once, adjusts its position, then marks a notch on the beam nearby. That's all. Not a name, not a number, just a line that means this one's done. Outside, you hear a voice, a tenant, probably, asking if it'll be ready by sundown. The miller says, Aye, if the water keeps. He doesn't mention the toll. He doesn't need to. It's not up for debate. But you can still hear the sigh in the man's voice as he walks away. That's how it works. Not fair, not unjust, just known. Grain comes in, toll comes out, the wheel turns, the miller measures, and someone somewhere grumbles into their sleeve. The mill has gone quiet, not forever, just for now. Outside, the stream has stiffened, not with a current, but with frost. You step carefully across the stone threshold. The air inside is colder than you remember. The smell of flour still lingers, but fainter, as if the dust itself has decided to sleep. The wheel is motionless, the sluice gate frozen in place. Everything in here waits. This section leads gently into winter. When the water froze, the flour stopped, and even the most seasoned miller admitted that nature, occasionally, had the upper hand. Let's begin with the mainstream fact. Medieval English watermills didn't run year-round. Winter brought unpredictable conditions, freezing streams, iced-up sluices, and stone-cold gears. When water froze or slowed too much, the entire operation paused, not dramatically, not loudly, just inevitably. Some mills were designed with winter in mind, deeper channels, more protected wheels, heavy coverings over the gearing. But even the best prepared mill couldn't function if the stream itself stopped flowing. If the wheel couldn't turn, neither could the stones. And if the stones didn't turn, there was no flour. That meant families and manors had to plan ahead. Grain was milled and stored before the first frost. Sacks were piled in lofts, in pantries, even buried in barns. Some estates stockpiled flour in barrels lined with linen, sealed with wax or oil to keep out moisture and mice. Millers would often announce their last grind of the season, an informal ritual when neighbors queued early, hoping to get their grain in before the sluice seized up. And yet, it wasn't always enough. Now for the quirky bit, one document from 1324 describes a winter so long and cold that the local squire ordered the miller to break the ice daily with a hammer, just to prove he was earning his toll. The record notes that after 3 days, the miller stopped showing up. No one punished him. Everyone understood. The hammer froze to the doorpost. Millers often had winter tasks to tide them over. They redressed stones, cleaned gearboxes, replaced warped beams. Some became de facto blacksmiths or wagon repairers. Others helped butcher livestock. But all of it was secondary work, meant to fill the time until water began moving again. And during those still months, flour became precious, households rationed, bread was baked in flatter loaves, stretched thinner with oat husk or bean flour. Alewives brewed with dried malt. Porridge turned a little lumpier, and in some cases, neighbors shared, not out of generosity, necessarily, but because when the mill stopped, everyone became equally uncomfortable. Here's the scholarly uncertainty. How frequent and severe were these milling interruptions? Climate historians point to records of the Little Ice Age beginning in the late 13th century, suggesting colder, longer winters across northern Europe. But localized effects are harder to track. Some areas saw only brief freezes. Others endured weeks without functioning mills. Written records tend to exaggerate or ignore the details. Parish accounts occasionally note lost grinding days. A few monastic dairies reference poor loaf seasons, disputes which may have resulted from mill inactivity. But for the most part, these silences aren't documented, perhaps because winter itself was expected to be inconvenient. The mill wasn't broken, it was just cold. A fringe anecdote in Dorset, one early 15th century account, tells of a family who placed hot stones in a basket and carried them upstream to thaw the mill race. It didn't work, but their bread was warmer than most that winter. You step into the far corner of the mill, where unused sacks slump like sleeping dogs. The air is thick with stillness. The runner stone rests unevenly atop the bedstone, paused mid-shift. A light frost crystals the window ledge. Outside, the stream has stopped speaking, but the silence doesn't feel abandoned. It feels rehearsed. The mill isn't broken. It's hibernating. This isn't failure. It's rhythm. The other side of the same cycle that began in spring with a grain sack and a turning wheel. Even the most efficient tools in the world, the millstone, the gear, the sluice, must rest. And when they do, they don't complain. They don't shout. They wait. They wait for thaw. And until then, the bread grows thinner, the morning's colder, and the miller, if he's clever, leaves a note carved into the beam. Try again in March, when the mill starts up again, after the frost has melted. After the stream remembers how to flow, there's always something a little off. A thud where there should be a murmur. A hesitation in the wheel's first spin. The mill doesn't complain. Exactly. It just clears its throat, like a room waking up after too long without footsteps. This is when the millwright arrives. Not the miller, the day-to-day operator you've grown familiar with. The millwright is something else. He doesn't live here. He doesn't grind flour. He arrives with tools, a slow stride, and the permanent expression of someone who prefers wood shavings to conversation. This section is for them, the silent adjusters, the repairers of rhythm, the ones who never rushed, never explained, and always knew what needed fixing before anyone else noticed it was broken. Let's begin with your mainstream fact in medieval England. Millwrights were skilled artisans responsible for the construction, repair, and precise alignment of watermills. Their job wasn't to operate the mill, but to make sure it could operate, to align the gears, set the stones, adjust the shaft, and make the entire mechanism work as one continuous, turning whole. They were part carpenter, part engineer, part mystic, because when a mill broke, or even slowed slightly, no one grabbed a wrench. They sent for the millwright, often from miles away, and he would come with chisels, wedges, mallets, files, a bit of wax, and no particular interest in explaining what he was about to do. Now for the quirky bit, millwrights had reputations for being quietly eccentric. They worked by feel as much as by measurement, often using personal sets of wooden templates and strings marked with charcoal, not formal blueprints. Many refused apprentices, not out of secrecy necessarily, just habit. Their knowledge wasn't written, it was weighted in their hands. There's one record of a millwright in Sussex who would only work barefoot. He claimed he could hear the gear teeth through the soles. No one argued, because his mills worked. Another millwright in Lincoln refused to repair mills during Lent, citing the bad turn of winter wood. He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't have to. People waited until Easter. These men didn't work fast, but they worked well. Repairs might take days. A gear would be planned, realigned, reset. The pit wheel would be lifted with ropes, shimmed, spun by hand. The force tree, the beam that supported the runner stone, would be checked for warping. One tooth out of line could ruin a week's flour. And here's the scholarly uncertainty: how standardized were millwrighting techniques across regions. Some historians believe there were widespread oral traditions, shared systems of proportions, materials, and tool use. Others argue millwrighting was highly individual, with each craftsman developing his own methods. Surviving tools are rare, surviving instructions rarer. What we do know is that most millwrights worked alone or in pairs. They traveled light, and they were trusted, even feared a little, not because they were powerful, but because they understood something no one else did, and the millers knew better than to interrupt. You're standing near the gear assembly now, where the vertical shaft meets the wallower and pit wheel. The teeth have been greased, possibly with tallow, or a mix of animal fat and crushed chalk. It doesn't smell good, but it works. The wheel, previously sluggish, now turns with a soft clicking sound, not perfect, but promising. The millwright stands nearby, not watching the wheel, but listening to the sound the floor makes as the shaft turns. He taps a beam with a small wooden mallet, then nods, not to you, to the wood. He hasn't spoken in hours. One fringe anecdote in Devon. A millwright was known for carrying a bag of birdseed. When adjusting a wheel, he'd sprinkle seed across the wooden teeth. If the wheel turned too violently, the seed flew out. If it turned smoothly, The seed held. Some claimed it was superstition. He called it working with witnesses, back in your mill. The stones turn again, not loudly, but confidently. The millwright checks one last wedge, pockets his knife, and walks outside without comment. The miller watches him go, then moves to the hopper and pours in a handful of grain. That's all, because the work of a millwright doesn't end with applause. It ends with function, and while the wheel turns, no one thinks about him, which is exactly how he likes it. The hopper is full, the water flows, the wheel turns, and yet, the miller doesn't rest. He steps closer to the mechanism, slowly, as if it might start speaking, and listens for a beat that's not quite right. He tugs the tenoring lever just slightly, checks the feed, then runs his fingers through the fresh flour like he's reading something in it. This section is about finesse, not fixes, not repairs, just the everyday nudges and shims and patient twitches that kept a medieval watermill running. Because when everything works, it's not because force was applied, it's because something was moved just enough. Let's begin with the mainstream fact. The successful operation of a medieval mill relied less on brute strength and more on small, constant adjustments. The spacing of the stones, the angle of the hopper, the tension in the drive shaft, all of it could shift throughout the day. A miller didn't start the mill so much as accompany it, correcting as he went. And the most important adjustment, the tentering mechanism, a wooden or iron lever attached to a wedge or screw system, used to raise or lower the runner stone, too close to the bedstone, and the grain burned too far, and it wasn't ground at all. The proper spacing was somewhere between almost touching and close enough that you can hear it breathe. Miller's trick, a pinch of flour rubbed between thumb and forefinger. Too coarse, lower the stone. Too warm, raise it. Too oily, clean the grooves. Too silent, panic. Here's the quirky bit. Many millers developed subtle personal signals. Knuckle taps on wood. Patterns of shoe scuffs near the hopper. Little scratches on the tenter lever to mark the sweet spot. Not because they couldn't remember, because conditions changed hour by hour. Grain quality, air humidity, stream strength, none of it stayed constant. And flour doesn't care about theory, it cares about the next turn of the wheel. There's a quiet dignity in this kind of adjustment, not innovation, not invention, just the careful watching of something already working to help it work a little better. Some millers carried a thin wedge of oak tucked into their belts. Others kept a piece of chalk behind one ear to mark the stone's rotation. One elderly miller in Kent used a split chicken feather to test the stone gap. If the feather passed through, he'd lower the runner. If it snagged, he'd lift. He called it talking to the stone. And now for the scholarly uncertainty, how much of this finesse was taught, and how much was learned through experience. Historical records mention miller apprenticeships, but few training manuals survive. What little we know suggests a blend of inherited habits and hard-earned knowledge. A young apprentice might spend years doing nothing but watching, sweeping, bagging, and listening before being allowed near the tenter lever. It was less about teaching the technique and more about absorbing the rhythm. Millers didn't always agree, either. One might grind rye slowly, another fast. One favored a fine sifting, another left bran in. These differences weren't errors, they were style. One fringe anecdote of 15th century mill in Worcestershire employed two brothers, both trained by the same father. One ran the mill Monday through Thursday, the other worked Friday and Saturday. Villagers swore they could tell the difference in the flour, depending on which brother had tended the stones. They preferred the older brother's batch. The younger never argued. He just claimed his flour was more conversational. Back in your mill now. The air hums with steadiness. The flour pours smoothly, not fast, not in clumps, just a clean ribbon of powder settling into the sack. The miller doesn't look pleased. He looks watchful, because even now, something could shift. A sudden knot in the grain, a slightly warped gear, a loose beam, and if it does, he'll know, not by noise, by tone. He steps up again, adjusts the feed by a fraction, recenters the sack, runs a palm across the chute's edge. Nothing's wrong, but nothing's ever fully right for long. Because milling isn't about perfection, it's about attention. The right kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need thanks or applause or acknowledgement, just a small, daily respect for something that works better when you're kind to it. The stone grinds on, not because it was forced, but because someone listened and responded. You follow the grain this time, not the wheel, not the stones, not the cleverness of wedges and flour-pinched fingers, but the grain itself, from stalk to sack, from field to flour. This section flows gently through the entire journey of grain in a medieval English village, not as a grand process, but as a quiet one, familiar, seasonal, and conducted with more patience than pride. Let's begin with the mainstream fact grain in medieval England moved through a well-worn cycle, shaped by both custom and necessity. It was planted in the early autumn, usually wheat, barley, or rye, depending on local soil and what kind of bread the manor wanted on its table. It grew through winter, sprouted in spring, and was harvested by midsummer. The harvesting itself was slow and careful. Grain wasn't just cut, it was bound in sheaves, dried in the field, then stacked into stooks, small upright bundles that let the wind and sun pull the moisture out. This took time. Rain could undo a week's work, so harvest was part work, part weather management. Once dried, the grain was carted by ox, mule, or back to barns or granaries. Not sleek silos, just wood-framed buildings with stone floors and beams high enough to hang bundles from. Rats were common, cats were essential, and there was always someone checking the corners for signs of dampness or spoilage. Then came threshing. And here's your quirky tidbit in small villages. Threshing often doubled as a social event, done communally with flails, wooden boards, or even bare feet on packed earthen floors. It wasn't fast, but it was rhythmic, and many songs survive in fragmentary form that scholars believe were timed to the beat of flails hitting sheaves. After threshing, the winnowing began. This involved tossing the grain into the air so the wind could carry off the lighter chaff, sometimes done outside, sometimes inside, near an open window with a strong draft. In colder months, families winnowed by the hearth, sending grain dust into the fire and occasionally into someone's tea. Now the grain was ready for milling. It was poured into sacks, often linen, sometimes wool, depending on what was available. These sacks were heavy, up to 30 or 40 kilograms. They were marked with notches, knots, or loops of colored thread to indicate ownership. The walk to the mill wasn't long, but it was frequent. No one ground a whole season's grain at once. That would be risky. You brought a sack when you needed flour, or when you had time, or when the miller wasn't already busy. The sack was weighed, sometimes by balance, more often just by hand and familiarity, and the grain poured into the hopper. You know the rest. The wheel turned, the stones ground, the flour fell. But here's what people often forget: the flour wasn't the end. After milling, the flour was sifted, not by machine, by hand. Through bolting cloths, woven linen stretched over frames, rubbed in circular motions until finer flour dropped through and coarser bits remained. This determined the flour's grade: fine white flour for feast day loaves, middling flour for daily bread, coarse flour for porridge, gruel, or ale. And it didn't always happen at the mill. Often, the flour came home unsifted, and each household did the final work themselves, over a barrel, on a bench, with a cat watching, because cats were always watching. Now the scholarly uncertainty: how standardized were these grain-to-flour processes across medieval England, while the general steps are well documented. The specific practices varied enormously based on region, wealth, climate, and even local superstition. Some mills were equipped with built-in sifters, others left all separation to the user. Some households used bolting cloth, others just blew gently on their flour and hoped for the best. One fringe anecdote: a 14th century cook in York reportedly developed a tasting test to grade flour by rolling a pinch on her tongue and listening for grit. Her tongue, she claimed, could detect overmilled barley. No one doubted her, possibly because she threw ladles. You step now into the storage room beside the milling floor. Sacks lean against the wall, some full, some waiting. The flour inside is still warm, soft from the friction of the stones. You lift a handful. It falls between your fingers like fine sand, quiet, uncertain, useful. This is the final step, not the grinding, not the growing, not even the sifting, just this flour, ready to be kneaded, to be baked, to be shared. All of it began in a field, passed through hands, fell into rhythm, became food. The journey of grain is not grand. It doesn't end in applause or ceremony. It ends in a sack, in a cupboard, in a crust torn apart between tired fingers, and somewhere, back upstream, the wheel still turns. The mill has gone dusky now, and you're still here, not out of duty or delay, but because leaving would break the spell too suddenly. Outside, the sun has settled low behind the hedgerows, casting long, soft shadows that stretch across the water's surface like thin threads being pulled loose. You don't rush to the door. Instead, you let yourself remain just a bit longer beside the flower-scented silence of the wheel's final turn. This section isn't about work anymore. It's about the space that exists just after, that floating quiet, when even the mill seems to breathe slower. Some say mills fall asleep when no one's watching, not shut down, not abandoned, just resting. The stones are still warm from the day's rhythm, but the hum is gone. No more grain to sift, no more adjustments to make. You reach out and touch the side of the hopper lightly. It's empty, of course, but there's a softness to it, as if the absence of grain has weight of its own. Above you, The timbers creak faintly in the cooling air. The scent of dust and grain is heavier now, unmoving, outside. The stream flows at half its afternoon pace. Even the water seems to understand that the day is done. And yet, not everything has stopped. There's a strange, peaceful continuity in the air, the sort that makes thoughts slow down and stretch. You imagine how many nights like this the mill has known, how many twilights it has witnessed with no witness of its own. There's no audience here, no ceremony, just process, then stillness, then sleep. You sit on the old bench again, the one with the notch worn deep into its center. The flour on your sleeves has settled into your skin. You make no effort to brush it away. You smell of stone, grain, dust, and wood smoke. It's not unpleasant. Somewhere not far off, a lowing cow calls once and then quiets. A distant door thuds closed. A bird rearranges itself on a branch and thinks better of making a sound. Everything is slowing, not to a stop, but to something less definite. The line between what's happening and what's remembered begins to blur. You think of the apprentice millers who used to sleep in the loft above. You can almost imagine the floor creaking under the weight of their dreams. You wonder what it must have felt like to fall asleep to the sound of slowly grinding stone, so steady, so close, so endlessly patient. Some said they dreamed of turning wheels, others of grain that ran too fast, or not at all. One boy, according to the miller, claimed he once dreamed that the mill ground stars instead of wheat, and that the flour glowed for days afterward. No one believed him, but for a week after. Villagers swore the bread felt warmer in their hands. That dream lingers as you listen again, not to the mill, but to yourself. You hear nothing urgent, nothing waiting, no footsteps approaching, no new sacks to lift. The entire world feels dusted in flour now, soft at the edges, slow at the center, and just quiet enough that you could drift off right where you sit. And now we wind down. Let the rhythm flatten, let the words loosen their grip. You don't need the name of the stream anymore, or the name of the stone, or even the year. Those things will still be here tomorrow. What matters now is the space between moments, that gentle hum inside your chest that slows with every breath. You imagine the wheels still turning, quietly, lazily, not for work, but for memory. You imagine flour drifting from nowhere into nothing. You imagine the dust settling, and the stones sleeping, and the grain curling into dreams. Nothing creaks, nothing calls. You don't have to do anything at all now. Not even listen, not even think. Just breathe. Let your thoughts thin out like mist. Let them stretch and vanish, one by one. The mill is quiet now, and so are you.